Hello. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Bridging the Gap podcast, presented to you by SummitET, a preparedness solutions company. Today, we will address Crises Create Crises, applying the IDEA model to crisis communications at higher education institutions. This is the second part of a series focused on strategic communication for higher education, addressing sensitive and controversial issues. I'm one of your hosts on today's episode. My name is Holly Hardin. I'm the Director of Strategic Communications for SummitET. And joining me is Dr. Ron Edmond, former Acting Director for Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education, its Emergency Management Laboratory and National Emergency Management Program. He has been a guest lecturer at Rutgers University Leadership Academy. He's also a crisis communication instructor at Lee University, and he currently serves as a crisis communication subject matter expert with our strategic communications team at SummitET. Joining us today are Dr. Deanna Sellnow and Dr. Tim Sellnow. The Sellnows are internationally recognized scholars of risk and crisis communication. They have worked with such agencies as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, World Health Organization, United States Department of Agriculture, United States Department of Homeland Security, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and others to build theory and best practices for effective crisis and crisis planning, response, and recovery. They have published many articles and books that contribute to theory building and instruction for effective risk and crisis communication. Both have also edited highly regarded academic journals, and we are so honored to have them both here to share their expertise and insights on how crises create crises, applying the IDEA model to crisis communications at higher education institutions. In this episode, we're going to address how effective and simple strategic communication is central to reducing harm and saving lives, and how communicators and decision makers can integrate the IDEA model for effective instructional risk and crisis communication. This model is based on decades of research, ranging from case studies to qualitative surveys and interviews to message design and testing experiments. And we'll discuss how the IDEA model can be used by higher education to provide a framework that is easy to understand, remember, and employ, particularly during a time when many higher education institutions are encountering unprecedented crises.
Developed by Professors Deanna and Timothy Sellnow, the IDEA model uses 4 key components: internalization, distribution, explanation, and action, to craft messages and communicate them effectively.
So to kick us off here, I'd like to hand it over to my co-host, Dr. Ron Edmond, to address with the doctors the background and problem statement that we're trying to address here.
Yes, thank you again for joining us. It's good to see you guys again. So our first question that I wanted to get some perspective and some insight into is to describe the gaps and challenges the IDEA model was developed to address.
Initially, our research together pointed out that many of the risk communication messages had an overemphasis on an explanation process, explaining the science, leaving people concerned, but without the actions needed to protect themselves.
There was a real tendency to be sender oriented, like it was information output without a real receiver outcome orientation. Was the learning happening? Were people understanding what's going on, realizing its relevance, and taking the appropriate actions? We tended to focus on sender and information rather than receiver and outcomes.
And also, simply put, those who wanted to communicate science didn't have a ready-made template like this to help them in that translation process for those that are concerned and wanting to have that science translated into a comprehensible level.
This was particularly important because in crisis situations, there's a very short response time usually. And so the template, the idea of a template that's easy to use and employ was missing. There wasn't a simple thing for people that aren't necessarily scientifically schooled to use.
Excellent. So when we're talking about applying this idea model to higher education, can you talk a little bit through how the different aspects, the internalizing risk impact, the distributing the message, explaining the crisis, and so on, how this idea model could be applied to higher education institutions specifically?
Higher education is facing a number of different crises right now, ranging from a reduction in student population and increased debt load that they're not able to manage, but also some of the things that are happening in the world today, which are causing cascading crises in the higher education institutions. For example, the conflicts, Palestinian and Israeli conflicts, Ukraine and Russian conflicts. Because we are a globalized society, these issues are really critical for higher education to deal with and address, and we're watching them struggle with that right now.
And clearly, higher education is not immune to the same challenges that scientists face in trying to communicate complex risk communication information. These social issues that Deanna just mentioned are very difficult to discuss and need to be analyzed and need to be covered in a multifaceted way, and that's what the model helps them do.
So when we're talking about the I aspect of the idea model, the internalizing risk impact, how do communicators ensure recipients understand the potential impact of the risk or crisis?
Probably what we've learned in our research, the most important thing is to start with the receivers themselves, to find out how they are interpreting the situation and the risk, and starting with that, and then using that to build upon how to enhance what they believe and understand as the risk with some of the nuanced understanding about it from the perspective of the science. But start with the receivers and what do they believe, and especially when it's a polarized issue, really important to start there.
So it seems like it's important that the communicators and or the institution really know their population, know their stakeholders and their receivers. Have you seen a process that they use to really understand, engage their stakeholders and how their messages play out?
You know, it's a challenging situation, and as Deanna said, we always want to start where our listeners are and to listen to what they're saying. One of the aspects of internalization is to begin with dialogue and listening. Sometimes higher ed is very good at stimulating dialogue, listening to student groups, and sometimes that's not the case. So we cannot emphasize enough how internalization is not, as Deanna mentioned earlier, it's not linear as maybe messages were in the past. It's very much fueled by dialogue.
And that's probably one of the places where higher education could do a better job than we're perhaps doing right now, is starting with the listener and creating a mutual understanding about a situation rather than telling people what they ought to think about the impact and the relevance. Yeah.
That's a very important distinction there. I love that. It's not linear as a lot of us have been doing in the past. That's great insight. So I would assume that when you get to the D part, distributing the message, that listening aspect is very important in the phase beforehand, because you acknowledge where your recipients are congregating, if you will, where they're holding those dialogues. So what are some ways that institutions determine their most effective channels of communication when they distribute the message?
Well, it's funny. Because I know that many times in higher education, we distribute our messages through email, only to find out that our students do not check their email very often. And then we move on to better avenues for communication. But certainly we need to ask them what they use, find out what they use, and then get comfortable with those technologies.
Right. The handheld devices and every student, starting with junior high all the way through college, and even a lot of adults are glued to that handheld and to the various social media platforms, not the traditional platforms that us from the dark ages have been used to.
One of the things that we found out is that 20 years ago, the best practices in terms of risk and crisis communication often said, find out which spokesperson would be the best to send the message and which channel through which to send it. And what we've really discovered with the advent of 24/7 access to all these social media channels is it's really critical that we have multiple spokespersons converging, saying a similar message across multiple platforms to be effective.
Yeah.
Redundancy is not bad. Consistency is good.
That's great. I love that. Redundancy is not bad. Consistency is good. So falling in line with that, I think your insight about leveraging multiple methods of communication. Again, there's really not a one size fits all for us in communications anymore, and as consumers of the information that's being communicated. How do you determine the best communicator for the message to help minimize the impact on the institutional community?
Again, it depends on the target audience. And since there are different target populations, they tend to hold credibility differently in terms of different spokespersons and sources. And so it's important to make sure that you're finding out who are the opinion leaders for the target population that you're trying to reach. And those opinion leaders, and sometimes it's influencers, social media influencers, that need to help share the message because they have the credibility with the audiences that the scientific expert or academic researcher may not have.
There's such a variety of influencers, if you will, on college campuses. There's the special interest groups. There are the Greek community, the fraternities and sororities. There are the academics. There are the sports enthusiasts. There are trustees and researchers and all that. So it takes a lot of time and effort to really learn and research who those influencers are, and they're dynamic, especially in the student population. They keep changing. So we, it seems like, have to be very adaptive and be able to change along with that and continually monitor who those spokespersons are or will be.
You really tapped into an important thing there, Ron, and that is that we need to be vigilant during the quiet times. It's too late by the time a crisis erupts to try to find out who those influencers are. We need to establish what we've done a lot of work with communities of practice, which is a theoretical perspective by Levin Wanger about the need to have multiple stakeholders at the table during the quiet periods to create this network that can easily be tapped when the crisis emerges, because that, and making sure that we have the diversity of perspectives sitting around that table in the quiet times. Mm-hmm.
And just to echo the importance of diversity, if we leave someone out who is an influencer, that person in the current communication landscape has ample opportunity to reach a very broad audience on her or his own. And so it doesn't help us to leave someone out or avoid someone's message, because they will be heard.
Right. And the thing about them being heard is that they may not be sending the message that is really critical and important to those stakeholder groups or to their influence followers.
Right. They will fill the void with something, and we want to make sure that what they're filling the void with is accurate and the desired messages that we want to have being sent.
So the A aspect of the IDEA model emphasizes self-protective action steps. Can you talk a little bit about how the A aspect can be applied to areas where higher education institutions would be involved?
Well, surprisingly, the action element, which seems to me would be at the forefront, was missing in much of the research that we did. People were made aware of situations. They were aware that it could affect them. They had access to the information, but didn't really receive a clearly stated message about what they could do. So that's important. And we realized that without action, and we measured this multiple ways, the credibility of our message would deteriorate very quickly.
We also discovered that at the cultural norm of the United States is a self-efficacy. Individuals, what can we each do to protect ourselves and those we care about? But as we've done more work with across cultures, we've realized that collective efficacy is really critical. It might not be about what I can do because it's going to save me, but what about my community, and how could the community work together to mitigate harms and reduce risks? Really critical expansion of the model.
In the past, as I've taught crisis communication, I've talked about providing the stakeholders with action plans. Action plans on a multitude of levels. For instance, what you can do, what you should do, and what you must do, depending on where that crisis is in its timeline. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Oh, I would agree 100%. And the only thing I would say is in communicating that action plan, I would keep it crisp and clear so that listeners don't feel like there's so much to think their way through. As
Right.
Deanna said, in these difficult situations, oftentimes there's a short response time and there's always a short attention span. So
Right.
we need to be crisp and clear.
And another thing I'd just like to add to that is that the feasibility of those action plans
Yeah,
is critical. One of the things with the COVID-19 is when we did work with various cultural groups, particularly Hispanic and Latinx groups in Florida, they weren't able to do the social distancing because they were in multi-generational families. They
Right.
didn't have access to the masks, so they couldn't wear the masks. They were essential workers, so they had to do some of the things that we were saying you need to do or not do was not feasible for them to do or not
Right.
do.
So the idea model, it's been put into action in many different ways. Firstly, can you briefly describe how the idea model has been put into action, just to provide additional context for our listeners and viewers?
We worked with the United States Geological Survey to work on crisis warning messages in earthquakes that are high intensity impact. And what they wanted to do was have us come up with an app, a phone app, that would be, if you only had 7 seconds or less to take the appropriate action to protect yourself and those you care about, could we do that on a phone app in 7 seconds or less using the idea model? And we were able to message design and test that to become effective, and it actually did inform app development in California, in Southern California, where they have a lot of earthquakes. So I'm really proud of that. Yeah.
So that would seem even applicable with tornado warnings,
Definitely.
a hurricane, especially tornadoes, where we're in tornado season right now, where they just pop up, and there's just very little time frame in which to notify the public, and we know we can't necessarily depend on the sirens sounding, and in a lot of communities there are no sirens. So that app seems to be adaptable to those kinds of situations as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I would add to, even though hurricanes move more slowly than tornadoes or earthquakes, we've worked with the National Oceanic Atmospheric Agency to help them as they reconsider and design new messages, discussing that cone of uncertainty and how people interpret it, working with meteorologists, working with the Hurricane Center. Much of that work is based on the idea model to help them reconsider some of their warning messages.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask this: in taking that early warning app, could that be adapted to colleges and universities for situations that are occurring on campus that are spur of the moment? Like last week, there was a shooting on one of the campuses, and warning about active shooters or a protest or a whatever the situation happens to be.
Absolutely. I think it's prime for that sort of a adaptation to especially active shooter incidents, because it could happen very quickly. And what people need to know is not just the warning, just not the sound of the siren, but what to do, because you need to have muscle memory of just knowing what to do, because at the spur of the moment, there's a little bit of panic, and this reduces that panic to the action.
Can you share a case study where the idea model led to unexpected outcomes or learnings?
I can share our favorite example of where it came to unexpected learning. We were asked to join a group in Uganda that was studying response and warning to mudslides. And we went into the process thinking that we were going to help the government understand why people weren't responding to the different kinds of warnings. When we got into the situation, we quickly learned that villagers had a good sense of what was happening. They simply lacked, as Deanna mentioned earlier, the capacity, the ability to respond, and they had lost some of the trust that the government warnings could provide. And so we quickly realized we had to move back to understanding how. We started with action, which was a mistake. We had to go back and learn how the residents of Uganda in this district were responding or to the internalization of the risk.
It's really where we realized that internalization couldn't be us telling people what the impact and the relevance is to them, but to find out from them what the impact and relevance is about a situation.
It was a humbling experience, but we learned a lot from it.
So how much did culture play in that informative state?
Culture played a big role because in Uganda, we were a couple of United States Americans, very, very white,
Right.
coming in and not necessarily having any perceived trust. So it was really important for us to get opinion leaders from those communities that came with us to act as translators and buffers that were like, no, you can trust these people. These people are here to be helpful. That sort of thing was really critical. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. But I will say that as we've done research in other countries, we are finding consistency in the importance of all four elements working together on a message. So we're finding some good consistency and validation for the existence of those four areas. But clearly, as Deanna said, as a messenger, we need to build credibility.
Another thing I want to mention about that is we were crossing language barriers.
Uh-huh.
Not only did we not speak the language of Uganda proper, the language of the villagers was indigenous, and so even our translators had to have translators in order for us to communicate. And the role of nonverbal communication was amazing in terms of developing trust through nonverbal cues. Mm-hmm. I'll share.
And I just want to say, step one was always listening.
Mm-hmm.
Was
Right.
listening to what they had to say, and I think Deanna's going to share a story about just being a good listener to get the process started.
When we went to the community in the mountains in the Bududa district of Uganda, we were trying to learn the stories from the people that were living there. And there was a very well-to-do man with a goat. He had a mama goat and a baby goat, and he was sort of well off, but he stood way back from the crowd. He didn't join the crowd. And I stood back from the crowd too and was just there listening. And pretty soon he came over to me with his baby goat and handed the baby goat to me. And I saw that as a sign, and then I hugged the baby goat, but like, I'm going to trust you. I think I can trust you.
We knew things were going well then.
Yeah.
And we have a picture that one of our colleagues snapped a picture of it. We have that in our book, Before Crisis, about the idea model.
Yep.
Well, a great story there. So actually, there's an old song that my generation knows, and one of the lyrics is "Silence is golden." So in this case, silence is golden because it shows you're intently listening to the issues and concerns of those individuals that you're trying to communicate to. So that's really your first big step.
Yes.
Yeah, I think in higher education, one of the best things a person can do, for example, if there are concerns about a student, when you have the opportunity to meet with that student or that student group, the first step ought to be to just listen to their perspective. What's happening here?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent advice there. Based on your experiences, what future directions do you see for application of the idea model in addressing some of these emerging global challenges?
Well, I think in many ways we can talk about, reemphasize some of what we've covered. Deanna mentioned the cultural sensitivities that we need to learn more about. Dialogue is very important. As we've reconsidered the model over time, we have many more opportunities for soliciting feedback and initiating dialogue. So all that's very important. And I will say that I believe that there is some potential for the idea model and the dialogue that comes with it, particularly with internalization, to find middle ground in polarized issues. I believe that because we're listening to what individuals feel instead of assigning some sort of categorization or name to the position that they take. We start with What's the issue? How are you feeling about that? And then move forward. We find that some of the surveys and increasingly are showing that individuals on either side of the political spectrum value middle ground and believe that they're moving toward it.
That's a really good point. And another really good point, we've had the opportunity for the past 3 years to work with a multi-country research collaborative. It's called the Decipher Project, and it's 7 countries, researchers in crisis communication from 7 countries who are working together to look at government communication, citizen responses, and media coverage regarding we collected data from 1 full year of COVID, and we've been working together to understand the nuanced differences across the borders of these 7 different countries. And I think that collaborative research piece is also critical going forward with the globalized society that we live in.
Yes, you have to be optimistic if you decide to build theory together with scholars from 7 different countries.
It's been a challenge.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Any other areas or case studies or application of the model that you all would like to address before we close out today?
I think that one of the things that is probably the most critical for us going forward in some of our work is to try to capitalize on the quiet times, capitalize on building networks and building trust across these boundaries of culture and country, so that when crises do erupt, we've already got that network, that community of practice in place to be able to disseminate a redundant, consistent message across cultures and countries.
One of the things to support what Deanna is saying from a higher ed standpoint, so often when a new president comes in or a new dean comes in, there are opportunities for listening sessions and coalitions are built so that people have a chance during quiet times to share information. Sadly, as individuals are in place longer, individuals of leadership, some of that falls away or becomes less consistent. What Deanna's saying, I think, is let's keep it going. Let's make sure that we're good listeners all the time.
Strategic communication is ongoing.
A real great example of that effective means of getting out there reminds me of a president and first lady at a university where we worked previously. The president's home was on campus. They had a dog, and the president and first lady, sometimes together, sometimes separately, all times a day, would stroll through campus walking their dog, stopping and talking to students. And the dog loved to be petted. The students would pet the dog, talk to the president, talk to the first lady. It was fantastic. And I think they built a lot of good social capital with that simple presence.
Excellent advice. Thank you both so much for sharing the depth of expertise that you bring to bear here, and we could certainly go on much further here, talking about the wonderful work that you've been doing, and there are many ways to engage with Dr. Deanna and Tim. wearecrisis.com is one way. Before Crisis: The Practice of Effective Risk Communications, essential book to have in your library. Before Crisis: The Practice of Effective Risk Communication. Highly recommend that. Doctors, any other resources that you all would suggest or offer here?
No, I think those are helpful. And reach out to us at Clemson University. We're always willing to help.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks for giving us some time to visit with you today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to tuning in for future episodes. Dr. Ron, anything you'd like to offer before we close out?
No, we do thank you for providing insight and perspective on this idea model, and we hope that our listeners and our viewers will take this model and take those parts, take all of the model, but especially concentrate on some of those issues within the idea model that are critical and need immediate attention, and then incorporate the entire model at some point in their strategic communication plans and procedures. So thank you both for providing us this insight.
Thank you for helping us to get the word out.
Yes.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Be safe, be well. We'll see you at another episode.